Ethan Carter hunched his shoulders against the biting wind, his breath curling into the frigid night air. The dim streetlights cast long shadows over the empty sidewalk, their flickering glow offering little warmth. His boots crunched against the fresh layer of snow, each step echoing in the quiet stillness of the neighborhood. It had been another long, exhausting shift at the mechanic shop, and all he wanted was the solitude of his small apartment. Four walls that expected nothing from him. The city had long since lost its charm, becoming just another place to exist rather than live. Ethan's world had shrunk to the simplicity of work, eat, sleep, repeat. Tonight was no different. He tugged his coat tighter, exhaling sharply, his mind already drifting to the comfort of his worn-out couch and the promise of dreamless sleep. But the night had other plans. The rhythmic crunch of his own footsteps was a familiar sound, a comforting monotony, until it wasn't. Another set of steps echoed behind him, soft yet deliberate. Ethan slowed, his pulse quickening as he strained to listen past the muffled hush of snowfall. Was it his imagination? The streets were empty, the storefronts dark, yet the faint shuffling persisted, matching his pace. He glanced over his shoulder, his breath catching. Nothing. Just the vacant street stretching behind him, lined with parked cars and untouched snowdrifts. Shaking his head, he forced himself forward, telling himself it was just the wind, just the cold playing tricks on him. Then he heard it again. Under the weak glow of a flickering street lamp, a figure emerged, thin, trembling, barely more than a shadow against the night. A German shepherd. Its fur, once thick and proud, was matted and dusted with frost. Its ribs pressed starkly against its skin, a silent testament to hunger and hardship. But it wasn't the dog's gaunt frame that made Ethan pause. It was its eyes. Golden, piercing, filled with something deeper than hunger. A quiet desperation, a plea. The dog didn't whine, didn't bark. It only stood there, watching him, as if waiting for something. Ethan clenched his jaw, willing himself to look away. This wasn't his problem, not anymore. Ethan had learned long ago that attachments were dangerous. They made you weak, made you hope. And hope had a way of breaking a man more than loss ever could. He turned away, his boots crunching forward, his resolve firm. The dog would move on. It had survived this long. It would survive another night. His breath came out in a sharp puff, his hands shoving deeper into his coat pockets as if he could bury the weight pressing against his chest. He didn't look back. He never did. But the sound of footsteps never faded. The dog followed, not too close, not too far, just a quiet shadow trailing in his wake. No barks, no whimpers, just the soft whisper of paws against the snow. Ethan ignored it. He had to. But with every step, something in him twisted, something old and familiar. A memory of warmth, of a time when he hadn't walked alone. A time when companionship hadn't felt like a burden. He clenched his teeth, shaking the thought away. This was different. The dog was just another stray, another lost soul in a world too cold to care. Still, it never fell behind. Ethan reached his doorstep and hesitated. The key was in his hand, the lock inches away. Yet he found himself frozen. The dog sat a few feet behind him, its golden eyes locked onto his, unwavering. It didn't move closer, didn't whine for entrance, just waited, patient and silent. As if it knew this decision wasn't about a door, but something far deeper, a choice, a moment. A crack in the walls he had built so carefully around himself, the cold bit at his fingers. He could walk inside, shut the door, forget. Or he could take one step back. Just one. His fingers tightened around the key. The dog waited. And for the first time in years, Ethan hesitated. The wind screeched through the empty streets, rattling street signs and whipping sleet into Ethan's face as he stood at his doorstep. His fingers, stiff with cold, fumbled with the key, but his gaze flickered back to the trembling figure just beyond the steps. The German shepherd remained rooted in place, her golden eyes never leaving his, though her frail body shuddered with every icy gust. Snow clung to her patchy fur, her ribs visible beneath the thin coat. Ethan clenched his jaw. It wasn't his problem. He had done enough by not shooing it away. The wind howled, and the dog shrank, pressing closer to the porch, as if the house itself offered protection. A sharp exhale fogged in the air before Ethan turned the knob, stepping inside to the warm solitude of his home. The door hovered half-closed, but his feet wouldn't move. The storm raged, but the dog didn't leave. Ethan gritted his teeth, a quiet war raging in his mind. He could close the door, pretend he never saw her. But he didn't. Instead, with a sigh, he pushed it open a few inches wider, stepping aside just enough to make space. He didn't call her in, didn't make a sound. The shepherd hesitated, paws hovering over the threshold. Her eyes flicked between Ethan and the warmth behind him, ears twitching as if bracing for rejection. Then, cautiously, she stepped inside. Ethan didn't move. He let her pass, watching as she sniffed hesitantly at the air, damp fur dripping onto the floor. He shut the door behind her, sealing them both away from the storm, the house suddenly feeling less empty. Ethan rummaged through his fridge, not quite sure why he was bothering. He wasn't keeping the dog, that much was clear. But she was here now, and the way her ribs jutted beneath her damp fur nagged at him. He found a container of leftover stew, not much, but enough. Setting a small bowl on the floor, he took a step back. The shepherd approached slowly, as if still uncertain whether she was welcome. Then, hunger won over hesitation. She ate, not like a ravenous stray, but with quiet efficiency, swift, but never frantic. Ethan watched, arms crossed. There was something controlled about her, something that didn't quite fit the image of a lost street dog. A survivor, maybe. He shook off the thought. She was just a stray. That was all. As she licked the bowl clean, Ethan told himself this was temporary. Ethan remained at the table, staring at the shepherd curled up near the fireplace. He hadn't invited her there, yet there she was, settled like she belonged. She watched him, golden eyes half-lidded, but alert. Not pleading, not hopeful, just waiting. Ethan huffed, running a hand through his hair. This was a mistake. He wasn't the type to take in strays, and he sure as hell wasn't looking for company. Yet something about the quiet presence of the dog unsettled him more than it should. Shaking his head, he stood and grabbed an old towel, tossing it onto the floor near the hearth. "Dry off," he muttered, more to himself than her. The shepherd didn't move, just flicked her ears. Ethan scoffed. "Suit yourself." Ethan leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed, determination settling in his chest. He'd take her to the shelter first thing in the morning. They had space. They had people who actually wanted to deal with this. He wasn't that person. The dog's gaze followed him, unreadable, as if she sensed the decision forming in his mind. "This isn't happening," he muttered. "I don't do this." The shepherd gave no reaction, no whimper or protest. She simply shifted slightly on the towel, resting her head on her paws. Ethan scoffed. Maybe she understood, maybe she didn't. Either way, it didn't matter. Tomorrow, she'll be gone. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Ethan lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, the storm's howls muffled by thick walls. He should have been asleep, but something gnawed at his awareness. A sound, faint, trembling, whimpering. He turned his head. In the dim light, the shepherd twitched in her sleep, paws jerking against the floor. A soft, broken sound escaped her throat. Pain, fear, something buried deep in her subconscious. Ethan clenched his jaw, forcing himself to look away. It wasn't his problem. It wasn't. The whimpering grew louder, a small, pitiful cry. His chest tightened. With a sigh, he swung his legs over the side of the bed, rubbing a hand over his face before moving toward the sleeping dog. He crouched beside her, hesitant. "Hey," he murmured. The shepherd stirred, ears flicking. Slowly, the whimpers faded. Ethan exhaled. It's just a dream. He wasn't sure if he was telling her or himself. Ethan tightened his coat as he glanced at the shepherd curled up by the fireplace. The storm had passed, leaving a crisp, biting cold outside. He reached for his truck keys, exhaling slowly. "All right, time to go," he muttered, more to himself than to the dog. He expected it to hesitate but eventually comply. But as he opened the door, Shadow didn't move. The dog just lay there, watching him. Ethan sighed. "Come on, don't make this harder than it is." Still, the shepherd remained. It wasn't fear or defiance. It was something else, something pleading. The wind howled through the open door, and after a long moment Ethan let out a frustrated sigh. "Fine, but just for a few days." The shepherd's amber eyes locked onto Ethan's, unwavering and quiet. It didn't whimper, didn't beg, just waited. Ethan had spent years ignoring attachments, keeping people at a distance. But something about the way the dog looked at him made his chest tighten. He closed the door with a thud. "Couple of days," he grumbled. "That's it." Shadow wagged its tail once, slow and measured, then lay its head back down. Ethan shook his head, feeling foolish. He wasn't keeping the dog, he was just being practical. The shelter could wait a few more days. It didn't take long to notice. Wherever Ethan went, the dog followed. It moved soundlessly, always at his heels, never intrusive but never far away. "You're like a damn shadow," Ethan muttered one afternoon as he turned to find the dog sitting behind him. The name stuck. Shadow. That work for you? The shepherd didn't react much, just gave a slow blink before settling down. Ethan smirked. Figures, quiet type. Ethan worked in silence, grease coating his hands as he tightened a bolt under the hood of a rusted-out Chevy. Shadow sat nearby, watching him. "Used to have someone to talk to while doing this," Ethan said absently. "Dad taught me everything I know." He wasn't much for words, either. The dog tilted its head slightly. Ethan huffed. "Not that you care, huh?" Still, he kept talking. About old cars, about the customers, about how he once dreamed of opening his own garage before life got in the way. Shadow never interrupted, never judged, just listened. One evening, as Ethan was locking up the garage, a drunk customer stumbled in, slurring complaints about his car repair. He reeked of whiskey, stepping too close, his voice rising. Before Ethan could react, a low, guttural growl rumbled through the room. Shadow stood stiff, ears pinned back, eyes locked onto the man. "Whoa," the guy muttered, stepping back. "Didn't know you had a guard dog." Ethan glanced at Shadow, surprised at the sheer presence the dog had in that moment. "Yeah," he said, voice even. "Neither did I." The man muttered something and left. Shadow sat down, tail thumping once as if to say, "You're welcome." That night, the past clawed its way into Ethan's dreams. Flames, screams, a crumpled truck, his father's voice, then silence. Ethan jolted awake, breath ragged, sweat beating at his temple. Then warmth, a weight against his leg. Shadow lay there, head resting on his lap, unmoving. Not demanding attention, not intruding, just there. Ethan let out a shaky breath, running a hand through his hair. "You don't give up, do you?" Shadow's ears twitched, but it remained still. Ethan hesitated, then rested his hand on the dog's back. "Yeah, me neither." Mornings didn't feel as empty anymore. The silence that once pressed on Ethan's chest now felt lighter, filled with the soft padding of paws, the occasional jingle of a collar. He caught himself looking forward to coming home, expecting that quiet companionship. The house didn't feel so cold anymore. Shadow stretched out by the couch, tail wagging lazily. "Guess you're making yourself comfortable," Ethan muttered, but there was no real annoyance in his voice. If anything, there was something else, something he hadn't felt in years: belonging. Just when Ethan had begun to accept Shadow as part of his life, a discovery shattered that fragile peace. One evening, as he brushed Shadow's fur, his fingers ran over a small circular indent near the dog's ear, a scar. Frowning, Ethan leaned closer. Shadow stayed still, trusting. Then he noticed it, barely visible under the fur, a faded tattoo. Ethan's stomach tightened. A registration number. He grabbed his phone, heart pounding. He didn't want to search, didn't want to confirm what he already suspected. But he had to. And when the results appeared on the screen, his world shifted. Shadow belonged to someone else. Ethan ran his fingers through Shadow's thick fur, savoring the warmth of his loyal companion. But as he brushed over the dog's ear, his fingers paused. A faint, raised scar, almost imperceptible, ran along the skin. Ethan's stomach twisted as realization dawned. He gently parted the fur, revealing a brand, crude, ugly, and unmistakable. He had seen enough documentaries to recognize what it meant. Shadow hadn't just been a stray. He had survived something horrific. Ethan's mind reeled. Shadow hadn't wandered into his life by chance. He had run from a past filled with pain, from people who saw him as nothing more than a tool for profit and violence. The scars along his body weren't from the streets, they were from fights, from battles forced upon him for the sick entertainment of others. Ethan swallowed hard. Shadow had escaped, but was he truly free? That night, Ethan stood by his window, sipping coffee, trying to shake the unease gnawing at him. Then he saw it. A black SUV idled across the street, its engine humming softly in the still night. The windows were tinted, concealing whoever sat inside, but they weren't moving, they were just watching. His pulse quickened. Coincidence? Maybe, but every instinct screamed otherwise. Shadow lay at Ethan's feet, resting, until his ears twitched, his body tensed, muscles coiling like a spring. Then a low growl rumbled from his chest, deep and menacing. His hackles rose as his eyes locked onto the SUV outside. Ethan knelt beside him. "You know them, don't you?" he whispered. Shadow didn't need to answer. His reaction said it all. They had come for him. Ethan's mind raced. He could call the police, but what if they dismissed it? Without evidence, they might not take him seriously. He could pretend nothing was wrong, hoping the men would leave. But what if they didn't? What if they came back? What if they took Shadow? His grip tightened around the dog's fur. Shadow had suffered enough. No one was taking him away, not now, not ever. The sound shattered the silence. The front door crashed open, splintering under brute force. Ethan barely had time to react before Shadow sprang to life, leaping over the couch, his growl turning into a vicious snarl. Two men stepped inside, their faces hidden under dark hoodies. One held a crowbar, the other something worse, a gun. But before they could move, Shadow lunged, teeth flashing. Ethan grabbed the closest thing he could find, a wrench, and braced himself. The first man swung at Shadow, but the dog dodged, sinking his teeth into the intruder's arm. The man screamed, dropping the crowbar. The second raised the gun, but Ethan didn't hesitate. He swung the wrench with all his strength, knocking the weapon from the man's grasp. Chaos erupted. Shadow fought like an animal who had once been forced to, but this time it wasn't for sport. It was for survival, for freedom, for Ethan. The men scrambled back, one clutching his injured arm, the other cursing under his breath. They stumbled out the door, but before disappearing into the night, one of them turned back. "That dog belongs to us." His voice was cold. "This isn't over." Then they were gone. Ethan locked the door, his hands shaking. He could run, leave town, hide, hope they never found him. But that wasn't enough. They would keep doing this, to Shadow, to other dogs, to anyone who stood in their way. He grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name. Mark Reynolds. A retired cop. A man who once took down illegal dogfighting rings. Ethan had heard stories about him. If anyone could help, it was Mark. He hit the dial. "This is Ethan Carter," he said when the line picked up. "I need your help." An hour later, Ethan sat across from Mark in his dimly lit garage. Shadow lay between them, ears alert. Mark listened intently as Ethan recounted everything: the brand, the SUV, the break-in. "This isn't just about Shadow," Mark said finally. "These men, they're part of something bigger. And if they want him back this badly, it means he knows something they don't want getting out." Ethan exhaled sharply. "Then we expose them." Mark nodded, eyes gleaming. "It's risky. But if we do this right, we don't just save Shadow, we bring them all down." Ethan glanced at Shadow, running a hand over his fur. The dog had risked everything to escape his past. Now, Ethan would risk everything to make sure he never had to run again. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The night was thick with tension as Ethan stood outside the decrepit warehouse, his breath coming in short, controlled bursts. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, merging with the frantic barking of caged dogs inside. Then, chaos. Officers stormed the building, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like beacons of justice. Ethan clenched his fists as men in hoodies scrambled, desperate to escape. But there was nowhere to run. Shadow was at his side, his hackles raised, a low growl vibrating deep in his chest. He knew this place. He knew these men. One by one, the captors were subdued, handcuffed, and dragged away. The stench of blood and fear was suffocating. As officers pried open rusty cages, whimpers turned to hopeful whines. Ethan watched as dozens of dogs, battered but alive, took their first trembling steps toward freedom. He exhaled, relief and sorrow mingling in his chest. Shadow, his ever-faithful protector, pressed against his leg. It was over. Ethan knelt beside a trembling Labrador, its ribs pressing against thin skin, eyes hollow but flickering with the faintest glimmer of hope. He unlatched its chain, whispering, "You're free now." The dog hesitated before stepping forward, as if unsure whether to trust the feeling of open air. Shadow nudged the Labrador gently, giving an approving woof, and one by one the others followed. Chains clattered to the ground, a final punctuation to their suffering. Some limped, others hesitated, but none looked back. A handler from the rescue team approached. "They're going to need time," she said softly. Ethan nodded, glancing at Shadow, whose amber eyes held a quiet understanding. Freedom was a gift, but not one easily accepted after a lifetime of fear. He reached down, scratching behind Shadow's ear. "We all need time," he murmured. News reports flooded the airwaves. Illegal dogfighting ring dismantled, multiple arrests made. The world cheered, but Ethan couldn't. Sitting on his porch, he watched Shadow curl at his feet, breathing deep, peaceful for the first time in days. But scars remain, jagged marks on his body, shadows lingering in his eyes. Healing wouldn't be instant. Maybe not ever. "Hey, boy," Ethan whispered, running a hand down Shadow's back. The dog stirred, but didn't lift his head. Justice had been served, but what about peace? Could Shadow ever truly feel safe? Ethan exhaled, staring at the horizon. He'd given the dog freedom, but he couldn't erase the past. No one could. Shadow sighed heavily, resting his head on Ethan's boot. Maybe he didn't need to erase it. Maybe, just maybe, all they had to do was move forward, together. The first few nights Shadow still woke with a start, ears perked at unseen threats. Ethan never left his side. Each day, trust grew in small, quiet moments. A wag of the tail when Ethan returned from town. A soft whine for attention. The way Shadow no longer flinched when Ethan reached for him. One evening, Ethan sat on the floor, watching as Shadow eyed his outstretched hand. After a long pause, Shadow stepped forward, pressing his scarred muzzle into Ethan's palm. A silent declaration. "I trust you." Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat, stroking behind Shadow's ears. "We're gonna be okay, boy." For the first time since the raid, Shadow's tail gave a hesitant thump against the floor. Something shifted inside Ethan. Where he once trudged through his days, empty and aimless, now there was purpose. He found himself smiling more. Not the polite, hollow kind, real smiles. When Shadow would nudge his hand for attention. When he'd watch the dog chase a butterfly across the yard, ears flopping, tongue lolling in pure, unburdened joy. One afternoon, Ethan caught himself whistling. It startled him. He hadn't done that since before. Shadow looked up, ears perked, and Ethan laughed. It was rusty, unpracticed, but it was real. "Guess you're rubbing off on me, huh?" Shadow barked once, tail wagging. Maybe Ethan had saved Shadow's life. But the truth was, Shadow had saved his too. Late one evening, Shadow padded into the garage, emerging with something clutched in his jaws, a dust-covered toolbox. Ethan's chest tightened. He hadn't touched that in years. He knelt, gently taking it from Shadow's mouth. The metal felt cold, foreign. Inside, worn tools sat where he had left them, reminders of a past life. Shadow sat patiently, watching. Ethan exhaled. Maybe it was time to remember. Maybe it was time to build again. Ethan ran his fingers over the blueprints, tracing the faded lines of a dream left unfinished. His late wife's dream, a community shelter for abused and lost dogs. Shadow rested his head on Ethan's lap, watching him with quiet understanding. "We could do this," Ethan murmured. "For them. For her." His heart pounded. The past no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a promise. Months later, Ethan stood outside the new shelter, Shadow at his side. Excited barks filled the air as rescued dogs roamed freely in the yard, tails wagging, eyes alight with hope. Volunteers bustled, laughter ringing through the open space. Ethan crouched beside Shadow. "We did it, buddy." Shadow licked his cheek, pressing against him in silent affirmation. Ethan looked out at the shelter, their shelter. A place of safety, of second chances. A place where the broken could heal. A place where, finally, both he and Shadow had found home. Ethan stood in the middle of the shelter's play yard, watching as Shadow trotted toward a group of rescued dogs. Just months ago, the German Shepherd had been nothing more than a battered survivor of cruelty, but now he moved with a quiet confidence, his amber eyes no longer clouded with fear. Ethan exhaled, a realization settling deep within him. Redemption wasn't just for people. Every soul, no matter how broken, deserved love, safety, and the chance to heal. Shadow was living proof of that. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues across the shelter, Ethan knelt beside Shadow, running a hand through his thick fur. "You know," he murmured, "I thought I was the one saving you. But the truth is, you saved me just as much." Shadow tilted his head, as if understanding. In the darkest moments, when grief had weighed Ethan down, Shadow had been there, offering silent companionship, unwavering loyalty. Their bond had become a testament to the fact that true companionship was a two-way street. In rescuing Shadow, Ethan had found his own salvation. Love, Ethan realized, was more than just words. It was patience, the slow rebuilding of trust, the quiet moments of understanding. Shadow had been afraid of touch, of kindness, of anything unfamiliar. But love had mended what pain had broken. Love had softened the wary glances, soothed the trembling body, and rekindled a spirit that had once been dimmed by suffering. And in the process, Ethan's own wounds, those unseen, buried beneath years of loss, had begun to heal as well. Ethan looked around the shelter, watching as each rescued dog took hesitant steps toward a new future. Some had scars, both visible and hidden, but they weren't lost. They had found a place where they belonged, and so had he. He glanced down at Shadow, who sat faithfully by his side, eyes full of quiet devotion. "We made it, buddy," Ethan whispered. "We found our way home." Shadow nudged Ethan's hand, as if to say, "Yes, we did." Because in the end, no soul, human or animal, was ever truly lost, as long as someone was willing to believe in its worth.